misunderstand learning. It turns out that most of what we've been doing as teachers and students isn't serving us well. And comparatively small changes can make a huge difference. People commonly believe that the best way to learn something new is to give it dogged, single-minded focus and practice it over and over again till you get it down. And teachers believe that if they make learning faster and easier, they'll make it better. Unfortunately, or thanks God, researchers just turned this belief on its head and suppose that when learning is harder, is stronger, and lasts longer. Guys, I really advise you to watch this video after the very end, especially at the beginning of the first school semester, because today I'll give you several tips that can help you to save a lot of time and learning something correctly. All of these tips are based on the book Make It Stick, and I'm glad that I have an opportunity to read this book because it revealed a lot of different secrets, and right now I feel like I'm prepared to start my learning experience, and I think that I'm gonna save a lot of time with that. So if you're interested in that topic, and I suppose that you're interested in that topic, continue watching this video. Let's start with the most commonly used technique that doesn't actually work. This is rereading. And there are two problems with that technique. The first one, while you're rereading something, you don't learn. And the second one, you don't understand that you don't learn. Actually, while you are rereading something, you just get acquainted with the paragraph, and each subsequent rereading session is followed by undoubtable confidence that you understand the material. But this confidence is an illusion, because you cannot facilitate future transfer of what you read into new contexts and problems. It just doesn't work like that. You'll forget most of what you read in an hour, maybe even a shorter period of time. Instead of that unuseful technique, you should try another one. Test yourself. The act of retrieving knowledge from your memory has an effect on making this knowledge easier to call up in the future, in future contexts and problems. I read about different experiences in that book, and all of them showed impressive results. Students who tested themselves regularly showed far better results on the final exams.
For example, in one experiment, college students studied prose passages on various scientific topics like those taught in colleges, and then either took an immediate recall test after the initial exposure or restudied the material. After a delay of 2 days, the students who took the initial test recalled more of the material than those who simply restudied it, 68 versus 54%. And this advantage was sustained a week later, 56 versus 42%.
Checking the material. How does giving the feedback on wrong answers can affect our learning? Studies show that giving feedback on wrong answers strengthens our retention, and interestingly enough, some researchers show that delaying the feedback briefly produces better long-term learning than immediate feedback. It sounds counterintuitive. It is consistent with the research's results.
The learner quickly comes to depend on the continued presence of the correction. In the case of the students studying prose passages on science topics, some were shown the passage again even while they were asked to answer questions about it, in effect providing them with continuous feedback during the test, analogous to an open book exam. The other group took the test without the study material at the hand, and only afterward were given the passage and instructed to look over their responses. Of course, the open book group performed best on the immediate test, but those who got corrective feedback after completing the test retained the learning better on a later test. Delayed feedback on written tests may help because it gives the student practice that's spaced out in time. Spacing practice improves retention.
Are some kinds of retrieval practice are more effective than the others?
Tests that require the learner to learn, retrieve, supply the answer, like an essay or short answer test, or simply practice with flashcards, appear to be more effective than simple recognition tests like multiple choice or true-false tests. However, even multiple choice tests, like those used at Columbia Middle School, can yield strong benefits.
In fact, researchers indicate that testing instead of rereading facilitate better transfer of the knowledge into future contexts and problems, and improves one's ability to retrieve and retain material that is related but not tested.
Easier isn't better. Psychologists have uncovered a curious inverse relationship between the ease of retrieval practice and the power of that practice to enrich learning. The easier knowledge or a skill is for you to retrieve, the less your retrieval practice will benefit your retention of it. Conversely, the more effort you have to expend to retrieve the knowledge or skill, the more the practice of retrieval will entrench it. Why does effort help? When we have to put in effort to recall, as in spaced repetition, we have to reconstruct the material from our long-term memory rather than mindlessly repeating them from short-term memory. This strengthens the retrieval cues and its connections to prior knowledge. Mass practice versus spaced repetition.
Almost everywhere you look, you can find examples of mass practice.
Summer language boot camps, college that offers concentrations in a single subject with the promise of fast learning, continuing education seminars for professionals where training is concentrated into a single weekend.
Priming for exams is another form of mass practice, and it may feel like, productive strategy, and it may get you through the next midterm, but it will long be forgotten by the time you sit for your final. Spacing out your practice can feel less productive by a very reason that some forgetting set in, and you should make more effort in order to recall this material from your memory, and it doesn't feel like you are on top of it.
What you don't sense in the moment is that this added effort is making the learning stronger. Why is spaced practice more effective than mass practice? It appears that embedding new learning in long-term memory requires a process of consolidation in which memory traces, the brain's representations of the new learning, are strengthened, given meaning, and connected to prior knowledge, a process that unfolds over hours and may take several days.
Rapid-fire practice lives in short-term memory. Durable learning, however, requires some time for mental rehearsal and other processes of consolidation. Hence, spaced practice is better. The increased effort required to retrieve knowledge from your memory has an effect on retriggering this consolidation, further strengthening your memory. One super useful technique that can help you to apply this spaced practice, this is flashcards. Interleaving the practice of two or more subjects or skills is another alternative to mass practice, and here's a quick example of that.
Two groups of college students were taught how to find the volumes of 4 obscure geometric solids. One group then worked a set of practice problems that were clustered by a problem type. Practice 4 problems for computing the volume of a wedge, then 4 problems for a spheroid, etc. The other group worked the same practice problems, but the sequence was mixed or interleaved rather than clustered by a type of problem. Given what we've already presented, the results may not surprise you. During practice, the students who work the problems in clusters, that is massed, averaged 89% correct compared to only 60% for those who work the problems in a mixed sequence. But in the final test a week later, the students who had practiced solving problems clustered by a type averaged only 20% correct, while the students whose practice was interleaved averaged 63%. The mixing of problem types, which boosted final test performance by a remarkable 250%, actually impeded performance during initial learning. Compared to mass practice, a significant advantage of interleaved and variation is that they help us learn better how to assess context and discriminate between problems, selecting and applying the correct solution from a range of possibilities. In math education, massing is embedded in textbook. Each chapter is dedicated to a particular kind of a problem, which you study in class and then practice by working. Say 20 examples of homework before you move on. The next chapter has a different type of problem, and you dive into the same kind of concentrated learning and practice of that solution. But then, on the final exam, the problems are all mixed up. You are staring at each one in turn, asking yourself, which algorithm do I use? Whether in chapter 5, 6, or 7.
Several studies have demonstrated the improved powers of discrimination to be gained through the interleaved and varied practice. One study involved learning to attribute the different paintings to the artists who created them.
Researchers initially predicted that mass practice in identifying painters' works, that is, studying many examples of one painter's works before moving on to study many examples of another's works, would best help students to learn the defining characteristics of each artist's style. Mass practice of each artist's works, one artist at a time, would better enable students to match artworks to artists later, compared to interleaved exposure to the works of different artists. The idea was that interleaving would be too hard and confusing. Students would never be able to sort out the relevant dimensions. The researchers were wrong. The commonalities among one painter's works that the students learned through mass practice proved less useful than the differences between the works of multiple painters that the students learned through interleaving. Interleaving enabled better discrimination and produced better scores on a later test than required matching the works with their painters. The interleaving group was also better able to match painters' names correctly to new examples of their work that the group had never viewed during the learning phase. Let's imagine you're a student listening to the teacher explains you a material. Your brain converts your perceptions into chemical and electrical changes that form a mental representation of the patterns you've observed. This process of converting sensory perceptions into meaningful representations in the brain is still not perfectly understood. We call the process encoding, and we call the new representations within the brain memory traces. Much of how we run our day-to-day lives is guided by the ephemera that clutter our short-term memory and are fortunately soon forgotten. But the experiences and learning that we want to salt away for the future must be made stronger and more durable.
Remember, the process of strengthening these mental representations for long-term memory is called consolidation. And in consolidation, the brain organizes and stabilizes these mental traces. It may occur over several hours or even longer, and during that period of time, scientists believe that the brain gives it specific meaning. It fills in the blank spots and builds specific connections between this knowledge and your past experiences or other knowledge that is already stored in your long-term memory. Prior knowledge is a prerequisite for making sense of new knowledge, and forming those connections is an important process for your learning. So don't even try to understand something harder while you don't have the base of specific subject. For example, I made this mistake when I started to study physics. I started my studying from topics that were more interesting for me, and they were complicated, and I tried to understand each and every detail of them. But unfortunately, while I didn't understand the basic material, the basics of physics, I just couldn't get acquainted with these harder concepts. I just couldn't understand them. When we are incompetent, we tend to overestimate our own abilities and see little reason to change. And another, that as humans, we are readily misled by our own illusions and cognitive biases and stories we construct in order to explain how the world works around us and our role within it.
To become more competent or even expert, we must learn to recognize competence when we see it in others, become more accurate judges of what we ourselves know and don't know, adopt learning strategies that get results, and find objective ways to track our progress. Incompetent people lack the skills to improve because they are unable to distinguish between incompetence and competence. This phenomenon of particular interest for metacognition has been named the Dunning-Kruger effect after the psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger. Their research showed that incompetent people overestimate their own competence and failing to sense a mismatch between their performance and what is desirable, see no need to try to improve.
The most important thing is to make frequent use of testing and retrieval practice in order to understand what you really know and what you don't know.
We are born with about 100 billion nerve cells called neurons. A synapse is a connection between neurons enabling them to pass signals. For a period shortly before and after birth, we undergo an exuberant burst of synapse formation in which the brain wires itself. The neurons sprout macroscopic branches called axons that reach out in search of tiny naps on other neurons called dendrites. When axon meets dendrite, a synapse is formed. In order for some axons to find their target dendrites, they must travel vast distances to complete the connections that make up our neuronal circuitry.
In 2011's article, a team of British academics from the fields of psychology and sociology gave specific evidence from neuroscience that the architecture and the gross structure of our brain is fully determined by our genes, but the fine structure of neuronal networks can be influenced by our own experience and is capable of substantial modification. Another important discovery is that the hippocampus, where we consolidate our learning and memory, is able to generate new neurons throughout our life, and this phenomenon, called neurogenesis, is thought to play a central role in brain's ability to recover from injury and lifelong ability to learn. If you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Attitude counts a lot.
The studies of the psychologist Carol Dweck have gotten huge attention for showing just how big an impact one simple conviction can have on learning and performance. They believe that your level of intellectual ability is not fixed, but rests on a large degree in your own hands. Dweck and her colleagues have replicated and expanded on their results in many studies. In one of the early experiments, she ran a workshop for low-performing 7th graders at a New York City junior high school, teaching them about the brain and about effective studying techniques. Half of the group also received a presentation on memory, but the other half were given an explanation of how the brain changes as a result of effortful learning. That when you try hard and learn something new, the brain forms new connections, and these new connections over time make you smarter. This group was told that intellectual development is not the natural unfolding of intelligence but results from the new connections and are formed through effort and learning. After the workshop, both groups of kids lifted back into their classwork. Their teachers were unaware that some had been taught that effortful learning changed the brain, but as school year unfolded, those students adopted what Dweck calls a growth mindset and believed that their intelligence was largely within their own control, and they went on to become much more aggressive learners and higher achievers than students from the first group, who continued to hold the conventional view that Dweck calls a fixed mindset, that their intellectual ability was set at birth by natural talents that they were born with. Dweck's research had been triggered by her curiosity over why some people become helpless when they encounter challenges and fail at them, whereas others respond to failure by trying new strategies and redoubling their effort. She found that a fundamental difference between the two responses lies in how a person attributes failure. Those who attribute failure to their own inability and say, "I'm not intelligent," become helpless. Those who interpret failure as a result of insufficient effort or an ineffective strategy dig deeper and try different approaches.
Okay guys, that was everything for today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope that you found this video extremely useful. I hope that you will try to apply some of these techniques because they are really useful and they will help you to save a lot of time and study something new correctly so that you can actually remember this material. Okay, thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.